The lantern tipped over so slowly that Fiona Reynolds could see the amber flame dance through the air before it hit the floor, but her hands were tangled in the blanket she had been folding, and by the time she freed herself, the kerosene had already spread across the wooden planks like liquid fire. Within seconds, the cabin wall was ablaze, and black smoke filled the small room where she had been preparing for another bitter January night in Palisade, Colorado, in the winter of 1883. Fiona stumbled backward, her lungs already burning from the acrid smoke that rose in thick columns toward the low ceiling. She grabbed for the door handle, but the metal seared her palm, and she cried out, jerking her hand away. The fire had spread faster than seemed possible, racing along the dry timber walls with a hunger that terrified her. She could hear the timbers groaning and cracking as the flames consumed them, and she knew with horrible certainty that the cabin her father had built 3 years ago was going to be her tomb if she did not find a way out in the next few minutes. She pressed her burned hand against her skirt and tried to think through the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. The front door was impassable now, the entire wall a sheet of flame. The single window on the east side was her only hope. Fiona dropped to her knees where the air was slightly clearer and crawled across the floor, her eyes streaming tears that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with the choking smoke. Her fingers found the trunk at the foot of her bed, and she used it to pull herself upward, reaching for the window latch. The metal mechanism was stuck, frozen by the cold or warped by the heat. She could not tell which. Fiona pulled with all her strength, but it would not budge. Behind her, the fire roared like a living thing, and she felt the heat growing more intense by the second. She grabbed a pewter candlestick from the trunk and swung it at the glass, but the angle was wrong and the blow glanced off harmlessly. She tried again, this time putting her full weight behind the strike, and the window shattered outward in a spray of crystalline shards that caught the firelight like diamonds. Cold air rushed in through the broken window, and the fire responded with a surge that sent flames shooting toward the fresh oxygen. Fiona screamed as the backdraft knocked her sideways, and she fell hard against the floor, striking her head on the corner of the bed frame. Stars exploded across her vision, and the room spun sickeningly. She tried to push herself up, but her arms would not cooperate, and she felt consciousness slipping away like sand through her fingers. Through the haze of smoke and fading awareness, she thought she heard someone shouting her name, but the voice seemed to come from very far away, and she could not make her mouth form words to answer. The heat was unbearable now, and she knew she was going to die here in this burning cabin, alone in the wilderness, and no one would even know what had happened to her until they found her charred remains in the spring thaw. Then strong hands gripped her shoulders, and she was being lifted, carried, and she wanted to tell whoever had found her that she was too heavy, that they should save themselves, but the darkness was rising up to claim her, and she surrendered to it gratefully. Preston Hayes had been riding back to his ranch after checking his cattle in the western pasture when he saw the orange glow against the night sky. At first he thought it was just the sunset reflecting off the snow-covered mountains, but the sun had set an hour ago and this light was growing brighter rather than fading. He spurred his horse into a gallop, his heart pounding with a dread he could not name, and as he crested the ridge he saw the Reynolds cabin engulfed in flames. He did not remember dismounting or running toward the burning structure. His body moved on instinct honed by 26 years of surviving in harsh country where hesitation meant death. He could see through the shattered window that someone was inside, a dark shape crumpled on the floor, and without thinking, he grabbed the horse blanket from his saddle and soaked it in the water trough that stood beside the cabin. The front door was completely blocked by fire, but the window was large enough for a man to climb through if he was willing to risk the flames and broken glass. Preston wrapped the wet blanket around his head and shoulders and dove through the opening head first, tucking and rolling as he hit the floor inside. The heat was so intense it felt like being inside an oven, and he could barely see through the thick smoke that filled every inch of space. He crawled toward where he had seen the figure, and his hands found fabric, then an arm, then the unmistakable softness of a woman's face. Fiona Reynolds, the daughter of Samuel Reynolds who owned the neighboring spread. Preston had spoken to her perhaps a dozen times in the 2 years since he had bought his ranch, always finding her to be kind and intelligent, though reserved. He had admired her from a distance, noting the way she handled horses with gentle confidence and the quiet strength in her green eyes. But he had never worked up the courage to do more than exchange pleasantries. Now he hooked his arms under her shoulders and dragged her toward the window, his back screaming in protest as a burning beam crashed down where they had been lying just seconds before. He could feel the fire singing the hair on his neck and arms, could smell his own clothes beginning to char, but he did not stop moving until he had pulled Fiona through the window and into the blessed cold of the January night. He carried her away from the burning cabin, stumbling through knee-deep snow until they were far enough away that the heat no longer felt like it would cook them alive. He laid her down gently in a clear patch and stripped off his jacket, spreading it over her and tucking it around her shoulders. Her face was smudged with soot, and there was an ugly bruise forming on her temple where she had struck something, but she was breathing and her pulse was strong beneath his fingers when he pressed them to her throat. Preston turned back to the cabin, watching helplessly as the structure collapsed in on itself with a shower of sparks that rose into the dark sky like angry fireflies. Everything the Reynolds family owned was being consumed by those flames, every piece of furniture and clothing and memento, every tool and supply they had worked so hard to accumulate. The loss was staggering, and he felt a deep anger at the unfairness of it. A soft moan brought his attention back to Fiona, and he knelt beside her, cradling her head in his lap. Her eyelids fluttered and then opened, revealing eyes that were unfocused and confused. "Easy now," he said softly. "You are safe. I have got you." "The cabin," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "The fire. Gone," he told her honestly. "But you are alive, and that is what matters." She tried to sit up, but he pressed her back down gently. "You hit your head pretty hard. Just rest for a minute." "My father," she said suddenly, and there was panic in her voice. "Where is my father?" "I do not know," Preston said. "Was he inside?" "No, he went to town 3 days ago to buy supplies. He was supposed to be back yesterday, but the storm must have delayed him." She struggled again to rise, and this time he helped her sit up, keeping one arm around her shoulders to steady her. "He is going to come home and find everything gone?" "He is going to come home and find you alive," Preston corrected. "That is all that will matter to him." Fiona looked at the burning cabin, and her face crumpled. "Everything we had was in there. All of my mother's things, her jewelry and her Bible and the quilt she made before she died. The deed to the property, our money, everything." Preston felt her shaking, whether from cold or shock or grief he could not tell, and he pulled her closer against his side. "We need to get you warm and looked at by a doctor. Can you ride?" She nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand and leaving sooty streaks across her cheeks. Yes, I can ride." He helped her to her feet, and she swayed slightly before finding her balance. He kept his arm around her waist as they walked to where his horse stood patiently waiting, its eyes rolling white at the smell of smoke. Preston mounted first and then reached down to pull Fiona up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his back, and he could feel her trembling through the thin fabric of his shirt. The ride back to his ranch took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Preston kept his horse at a careful walk, not wanting to jar Fiona any more than necessary, and he was hyper-aware of her slight weight against his back and the way her arms tightened around him whenever they hit a rough patch. By the time they reached his barn, she had stopped shaking, but he could feel the chill in her fingers where they gripped his shirt. His ranch was modest but well-maintained, a 2-room cabin with a stone fireplace and sturdy furniture he had built himself. He had carved it out of the wilderness with his own hands and sweat. And while it was nowhere near as nice as the big spreads owned by the cattle barons down in Denver, it was his, and he was proud of it. He dismounted and helped Fiona down, noting that she was steadier on her feet now, but still moving like someone who had taken a hard blow. He led her inside and settled her in the chair closest to the fireplace, then set about building up the fire until the room was warm and bright. "I am going to get you some water and check you over," he said. "Then I will ride into town and fetch Doc Morrison." "No," Fiona said quickly. "Please do not leave me alone. I will be fine, truly. I just need to rest." Preston studied her face in the firelight. The bruise on her temple was darkening to purple, and her pupils looked normal enough, but he had seen men with head injuries who seemed fine one moment and dead the next. Still, the fear in her eyes was real, and he understood it. She had just lost everything and nearly died in the process. The last thing she needed was to be left alone in a strange place. "All right," he agreed, "but if you start feeling worse, I am going for the doctor, whether you like it or not." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Agreed. He brought her water, and she drank it gratefully, coughing a little as it soothed her smoke-raw throat. He found a clean cloth and dampened it, then gently wiped the soot from her face and hands. Her burned palm was blistered, but not too badly, and he cleaned it carefully before wrapping it in clean linen. All the while, she watched him with those remarkable green eyes, and he found himself acutely aware of how close they were, how intimate this moment felt, despite the circumstances. "Thank you," she said quietly when he had finished. "You saved my life. If you had not come when you did, I would have died in that cabin. I am just glad I saw the fire when I did," Preston said. He settled into the chair across from her, his own hands trembling now that the danger had passed, and the reality of how close she had come to death was sinking in. "What happened? How did it start?" Fiona closed her eyes, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. "The lantern. I was folding blankets and I must have bumped the table. It fell and the kerosene spilled everywhere. The fire just spread so fast, faster than I could have imagined. The door handle was too hot to touch and the window was stuck and I thought I was going to die there." "But you did not," Preston said firmly. "You are here and you are safe. For now," she said softly. "But what happens next? I have nothing left. No home, no clothes beyond what I am wearing, no money. My father and I had been saving for 3 years to buy more cattle in the spring, and all of that money was hidden in a jar behind the stove. It is all gone now." Preston leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Your father will be back soon, and you two will figure it out together. In the meantime, you will stay here. I have got space, and it would not be proper for you to be anywhere else in your condition." Fiona looked at him sharply. "I cannot stay here. What would people say? A single woman living with a single man?" "People can say whatever they want," Preston said. "Right now, you need a warm place to sleep and food to eat, and someone to make sure you do not take a turn for the worse from that knock on your head. Everything else can wait." She studied him for a long moment, and he held her gaze, letting her see that he meant every word. Finally, she nodded. "Just until my father returns. Then we will impose on you no longer." "It is not an imposition," Preston said. "It is what neighbors do for each other." He gave her his bed that night, insisting despite her protests, and made himself a pallet on the floor in front of the fireplace. He lay awake for hours listening to her restless movements in the other room, and watching the firelight dance across the ceiling, thinking about how strange life could be. This morning, he had been a solitary rancher, with nothing more pressing on his mind than whether his cattle had enough forage to make it through the winter. Tonight, he had a beautiful woman sleeping in his bed, and he had pulled her from a burning building like some kind of hero from a dime novel. He thought about the feel of her arms around his waist as they rode back to the ranch, the way she had pressed her face against his back as though drawing strength from his presence. He thought about the trust in her eyes when she had agreed to stay here, despite the impropriety of it. And he thought about how his heart had nearly stopped when he had seen her lying unconscious on that burning cabin floor. Preston Hayes had been alone for most of his adult life, preferring the company of horses and cattle to people, and he had convinced himself that he was content with his solitary existence. But having Fiona Reynolds under his roof had awakened something in him that he had thought long buried, a longing for companionship and connection that went deeper than mere physical attraction. He told himself not to be a fool. She was vulnerable and frightened, and he had just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Once her father returned and they made arrangements to rebuild, she would leave and he would go back to his quiet life and probably never see her again except in passing. That was the way of things, and there was no sense in imagining otherwise. But even as he told himself these sensible things, he could not stop the small flame of hope that had kindled in his chest, warm and persistent as the fire burning in his hearth. Fiona woke in the gray light of dawn, feeling like she had been trampled by a horse. Every muscle in her body ached, and her head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain that made her wince when she tried to sit up. For a moment she was disoriented, not recognizing the rough-hewn walls around her, or the weight of the unfamiliar quilt tucked around her shoulders. Then memory came flooding back, and with it a grief so sharp it took her breath away. Everything was gone. Her home, her possessions, all the careful work of the past 3 years, reduced to ash and charred timber. She pressed her face into the pillow and allowed herself a few moments of silent tears. mourning not just the material losses, but the feeling of security and stability that had been stolen from her in the space of a few terrible minutes. A soft knock on the door brought her head up, and she wiped hastily at her wet cheeks. "Yes? I have got coffee and breakfast if you are feeling up to it." Preston's voice came through the wood, gentle and respectful of her privacy. "No rush, though. Take your time." "I will be out in a few minutes," Fiona called back, surprised at how steady her voice sounded, despite the tears still wet on her face. She rose slowly, testing each movement for pain or dizziness, and was relieved to find that while she was sore and her head ached, she did not feel faint or nauseous. The dress she had been wearing was ruined, stained with soot and smoke and torn in several places. But it was all she had, so she smoothed it as best she could and finger-combed her tangled hair. She caught sight of herself in the small mirror hanging on the wall and barely recognized the disheveled woman looking back at her. Her face was pale except for the livid bruise on her temple, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of trauma and exhaustion. She squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. She had survived, and that was what mattered. The rest could be dealt with in time. Preston was standing at the stove when she emerged from the bedroom, stirring something in a cast-iron skillet that smelled unexpectedly delicious. He looked up when she entered, and his face brightened with a smile that transformed his rather stern features into something warm and appealing. "You are looking better this morning," he said. "How are you feeling?" "Like I was caught in a burning building," Fiona said, attempting a joke that fell flat even to her own ears. "But I am alive, and that is more than I had any right to expect last night." Preston dished eggs and bacon onto 2 tin plates and brought them to the small table by the window. "Sit," he ordered gently. "You need to eat to keep your strength up." Fiona did as she was told, suddenly ravenous despite the lingering taste of smoke in her mouth. The food was simple but well cooked, and she ate with an appetite that surprised her. Preston sat across from her, and they ate in companionable silence for several minutes before he spoke. "I was thinking I should ride into town this morning and let folks know what happened. Someone needs to tell your father when he shows up, and we should probably inform the sheriff in case there was anything suspicious about the fire." Fiona shook her head firmly. "There was nothing suspicious. It was my own clumsiness that caused it. I knocked over the lantern and the fire spread before I could stop it." "Even so, it needs to be reported," Preston said, "and your father will be beside himself with worry if he rides home and finds nothing but ashes." "You are right," Fiona admitted. She set down her fork and looked at him directly. "But I do not want to stay here alone. I know it is cowardly, but I cannot bear the thought of being by myself right now. Everything feels too raw and too frightening." Something shifted in Preston's expression, a softening around his eyes that made her chest tighten. "That is not cowardly. You have been through something terrible, and it is natural to want company. Come with me then. The ride will do you good, and you can pick up some supplies while we are in town." "I have no money," Fiona reminded him quietly. "I told you, everything was in the cabin." Preston waved this away, as though it were of no consequence. "We will worry about that later. For now, just accept the help that is being offered. You can repay me when your circumstances improve if it makes you feel better. But right now, the only thing that matters is making sure you have what you need." Fiona felt tears prick at her eyes again, and she blinked them back fiercely. She was not accustomed to accepting charity, and her pride chafed at the necessity, but she was also practical enough to know that she had no other choice. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will repay every penny, I promise you that." "I know you will," Preston said simply, and somehow that made it easier to accept. They rode into Palisade together an hour later, Fiona seated behind Preston on his big bay gelding. The town was small but bustling, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along the main street, with the Grand River flowing cold and swift just to the north. It had been founded less than 10 years earlier when the railroad came through, and it still had the raw, unfinished quality of a settlement that was still finding its footing. News of the fire had already spread somehow, as news always did in small towns, and people came out of the general store, and the saloon, and the bank, to stare as they rode past. Fiona felt their eyes on her and kept her gaze straight ahead, her chin lifted in silent defiance of their curiosity and speculation. Preston stopped first at the sheriff's office, a squat building with bars on the windows and a wanted poster flapping in the cold wind. Sheriff Dawson was a grizzled man in his 50s with sharp blue eyes and a no-nonsense manner that Fiona had always appreciated. He listened to Preston's account of the fire, and then turned to Fiona. "You are sure it was an accident, Miss Reynolds? No one had any cause to want to harm you or your father?" "I am certain," Fiona said firmly. "It was my own carelessness and nothing more." Dawson nodded slowly. "All right then, I will ride out and take a look at the site once the ashes cool down, just to be thorough. In the meantime, is there anything you need? Anywhere you can stay?" "She is staying at my place until her father gets back," Preston said, before Fiona could respond. His tone was matter of fact, but Fiona saw the way Dawson's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see," the sheriff said. "Well, that is mighty neighborly of you, Hayes. Miss Reynolds, you let me know if you need anything. Understood?" "Understood," Fiona agreed. She knew what Dawson was really asking, whether Preston was treating her properly and whether she felt safe in his care, and she appreciated the concern even as it embarrassed her. They left the sheriff's office and walked down the street to the general store, a large building that smelled of coffee and leather and the sawdust that covered the wooden floor. Mrs. Chen, the proprietor, came bustling over as soon as she saw them, her round face creased with concern. "Miss Reynolds, I heard about the fire. How dreadful. Are you all right? Do you need a place to stay? I have got a room above the store that is not much, but you are welcome to it." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen, but I have arrangements already," Fiona said. "What I need is some basic clothing and supplies. I'm afraid I lost everything in the fire." Mrs. Chen clucked her tongue sympathetically and began pulling items from the shelves with practiced efficiency. 2 plain work dresses, one in dark blue and one in brown, a warmer coat lined with sheepskin, a nightgown and undergarments, sturdy boots since Fiona's slippers had been ruined, a brush and comb, a bar of soap, a tin of tooth powder. The pile on the counter grew steadily, and Fiona felt a flush of embarrassment at the expense of it all. Preston stepped forward and began counting out bills from his wallet, but Fiona put her hand on his arm to stop him. "This is too much. I cannot accept all of this." "You need it," Preston said simply. "And like I told you, we will settle accounts later when things are back to normal." "At least let me limit it to the necessities," Fiona protested. "I do not need 2 dresses. One will suffice for now." "2 is hardly excessive," Preston countered. "What are you going to wear when you are washing the other one?" Fiona opened her mouth to argue further, but Mrs. Chen interrupted. "He is right, dear. Take what you need and do not worry about the cost. These things happen, and we all have to help each other out here on the frontier. That is the way it has always been." In the end, Fiona accepted the items, knowing that her pride was a luxury she could not afford at the moment. Preston paid Mrs. Chen and then loaded the packages into his saddlebags while Fiona waited outside, uncomfortable with being the object of so much charity and attention. They were preparing to leave when a buckboard came rattling down the main street at a speed that was reckless in the crowded thoroughfare. Fiona recognized the driver immediately, and her heart leaped with relief and apprehension in equal measure. "Father!" she breathed, and then more loudly, "Father!" Samuel Reynolds pulled the buckboard to a stop so abruptly that the horses reared slightly in their traces. He was a tall man with gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent working outdoors, and right now his expression was one of wild-eyed panic. "Fiona! Thank God!" He leaped down from the seat and crushed her in an embrace that drove the air from her lungs. "I just heard in the saloon that our cabin burned down last night. I thought you were dead. I thought I had lost you too." "I am fine, Father," Fiona assured him, her voice muffled against his coat. "Preston Hayes pulled me out of the fire before it was too late." Samuel released her and turned to Preston, gripping his hand with both of his own. "I do not have words to thank you properly. You saved my daughter's life, and that is a debt I can never repay." "No debt," Preston said firmly. "I did what any decent person would do. The important thing is that Fiona is safe." Samuel's eyes were bright with unshed tears as he looked between them. "Even so, I owe you a debt of gratitude. What happened? How did the fire start?" Fiona explained again about the lantern, and her father listened with a grim expression, shaking his head. "I should have been there. I should have come home when I planned instead of waiting out the storm in town. If anything had happened to you." "But nothing did," Fiona said gently. "I am here, and I am fine. We lost the cabin and everything in it, but we still have the land and the livestock, and most importantly, we have each other. That is what matters." Samuel took a shaky breath and nodded. "You are right. Of course you are right. We will rebuild, that is all. It will take time, but we will do it." "About that," Preston said carefully. "I was thinking that Fiona should stay at my place until you have a roof over your head again. I know it is not entirely proper, but it is better than having her sleep in a barn or in town where there will be even more talk." Samuel looked at Preston for a long moment, and Fiona held her breath, wondering what her father would say. Samuel Reynolds was a proud man who had always provided for his family, and she knew it would gall him to accept this kind of help from a virtual stranger. But he was also practical, and he loved her enough to put her welfare ahead of his pride. "I appreciate that offer more than you know," Samuel said finally, "and I accept it, but only if you let me work off the debt. I can help with your ranch while I am rebuilding my place. That way we are helping each other rather than you just doing charity work." Preston considered this and then nodded. "Fair enough. I can always use an extra pair of hands and the company will be welcome." They worked out the details there on the street, the three of them standing in the cold January wind, while passers-by watched with undisguised interest. Samuel would spend his days salvaging what he could from the burned cabin and starting the slow process of rebuilding. He would take his meals at Preston's place and sleep in the barn until something better could be arranged. It was not an ideal situation for anyone, but it was workable, and that was all that mattered under the circumstances. As they rode back to Preston's ranch, Fiona sitting behind her father on the buckboard, while Preston rode alongside them on his horse, she found herself thinking about the man who had saved her life. She knew very little about him beyond the basic facts that he had bought the old Harrison ranch 2 years ago, and mostly kept to himself. He was quiet, but not unfriendly, competent, but not boastful, and he had a kind of steadiness about him that she found deeply reassuring. She realized that she trusted him, this near stranger who had risked his life to pull her from a burning building and who was now opening his home to her without asking anything in return. It was a strange feeling, this trust that had formed so quickly under such extreme circumstances, but she did not question it. Sometimes you just knew when someone was good, and Preston Hayes was good all the way through. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Samuel spent his daylight hours at the burned site, clearing away debris and planning the new cabin, while Preston worked his ranch, and Fiona did her best to make herself useful around his house. She cooked their meals and mended their clothes and kept the place clean, feeling that it was the least she could do to repay Preston's hospitality. She found that she enjoyed the work, the simple satisfaction of keeping a household running smoothly. Her mother had taught her well before the consumption had taken her 5 years ago, and Fiona took pride in setting a good table and making the small cabin feel like a home rather than just a bachelor's residence. Preston seemed surprised and pleased by the changes, though he was too polite to say so directly. But she noticed the way his face brightened when he came in from the cold to find hot food waiting, and the way he lingered over his coffee in the evenings, clearly in no hurry to retire to his lonely bed. They talked during those evening hours, tentative conversations at first that gradually deepened into real discussions about their lives and hopes and the challenges of making a living in this hard country. Fiona learned that Preston had come to Colorado from Missouri after his parents died in a cholera outbreak, seeking a fresh start away from the painful memories. He had worked as a ranch hand for 3 years, saving every penny he could until he had enough to buy his own place. "It is not much," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, Samuel having already retired to the barn for the night. "But it is mine, and I built it with my own hands. That means something to me." "It means something to anyone," Fiona said. "My father felt the same way about our place. It was not the biggest or the finest, but it was ours, and we had worked for it. That is why losing it hurts so much, I think. It was not just a building, it was proof that we could survive out here." Preston nodded slowly. "You will have that again. Your father is a hard worker, and I can see that you are too. Give it time." "Time," Fiona repeated softly. "I suppose that is all we have, in the end. Time and the willingness to keep going, even when everything seems impossible." She felt his eyes on her and looked up to meet his gaze. There was something in his expression that made her breath catch, an intensity that she had not seen before. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the gentleness in his brown eyes, and she felt a flutter of something warm and unexpected in her chest. "You are very brave," Preston said quietly. "I do not think I have told you that. Most people would have fallen apart after what you went through. But you have kept your head up and kept moving forward. That takes real strength." Fiona felt heat rise in her cheeks and she looked away, suddenly shy. "I am not brave. I am just doing what needs to be done." "That is the definition of brave," Preston said. "Doing what needs to be done even when you are frightened or hurting, or both." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, just sat there feeling the warmth of the fire on her face and the warmth of his words in her heart. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, and she found herself wishing this moment could stretch on indefinitely, just the two of them in the firelight with the winter wind howling outside. But eventually Preston rose and banked the fire for the night, and they retired to their separate sleeping spaces with quiet good nights and the unspoken awareness that something between them was shifting, changing into something neither of them had anticipated, but both were beginning to welcome. The weeks passed and January gave way to February. The weather remained brutally cold with occasional snowstorms that made outdoor work nearly impossible, but on the clear days Samuel made steady progress on the new cabin. He had chosen a spot 100 yards from the burned site, on a slight rise that would give better drainage come spring, and the foundation was already laid. Preston helped when he could, and gradually other neighbors joined in as word spread. The Andersons brought timber from their land, the Johnsons contributed nails and tools, and even cranky old Mr. Peterson showed up one morning with his sons and worked for 3 days straight without complaint. It was the way of things in the frontier communities, everyone understanding that today's tragedy could be tomorrow's reality for any of them. Fiona watched the new cabin take shape and felt a strange ambivalence about it. She was grateful, of course, grateful for the help and the progress and the promise of having a home again. But she was also aware that once the cabin was finished, she and her father would move back to their own land, and she would no longer see Preston every day. The realization that she would miss him came as something of a shock. She had grown accustomed to his quiet presence, the way he listened when she talked, and the rare smiles that transformed his serious face. She looked forward to their evening conversations and the comfortable silences that fell between them. She noticed small things about him, like the way he was always gentle with his horses and how he never raised his voice even when frustrated. She was falling in love with him. She realized one morning as she watched him chopping wood in the yard. The sun was bright on the snow, and his breath came in white puffs as he worked, his movements economical and sure. He had taken off his coat despite the cold, and she could see the flecks of muscles beneath his shirt, the strength in his shoulders and arms. But it was not his physical appearance that drew her, attractive though it was. It was his character, his kindness, his steadiness in a world that seemed determined to knock people down. The knowledge terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She had never been in love before, had never had the time or opportunity for courtship in the hard scrabble life she and her father had led. And she had no idea if Preston felt anything for her beyond neighborly concern and the natural protectiveness any decent man would feel toward a woman he had rescued. She tried to push the feelings away, telling herself she was being foolish and inappropriate. Preston had given her shelter in her time of need, and she was repaying his kindness by developing romantic notions about him. It was wrong and embarrassing, and she needed to get control of herself before she did something mortifying like confessing her feelings. But the heart, Fiona was discovering, did not respond well to logic and reason. The more she tried not to think about Preston, the more he occupied her thoughts. She found herself watching for his return when he was out working, listening for the sound of his voice, looking for excuses to be near him. She took extra care with her appearance, brushing her hair until it shone and pinching her cheeks to give them color. She felt like a foolish girl with her first infatuation, and she berated herself for it even as she could not seem to stop. If Preston noticed her attention, he gave no sign of it. He remained polite and friendly, but never crossed the line into anything that could be considered improper or forward. Sometimes she thought she caught him looking at her with an expression that might have been longing, but the moment always passed so quickly she could not be sure she had not imagined it. Valentine's Day came and went without comment, though Fiona could not help thinking about the holiday and what it represented, love and courtship and the promise of romance, all things that seemed impossibly distant from her current reality. She made a special dinner that evening, roasting a chicken and baking biscuits and even attempting a dried apple pie, though she had never been much of a baker. Preston and Samuel both praised the meal extravagantly, and Preston ate 2 pieces of the pie, despite its slightly burned crust. After Samuel had gone out to the barn, Preston helped Fiona wash the dishes, standing beside her at the basin and drying while she washed. "That was a fine meal," he said as he carefully dried a plate. "You did not have to go to so much trouble." "I wanted to," Fiona said truthfully. "You have been so kind to us, letting us stay here and eat your food and use your supplies. It is the least I can do." Preston was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice was lower, more serious. "Fiona, I need you to understand something. Having you here is not a burden or an obligation I am fulfilling out of duty. I am glad you are here. This place has felt more like a home in the past 6 weeks than it has in the 2 years I have owned it, and that is because of you." Fiona's hands stilled in the dishwater, and she turned to look at him. He was not quite meeting her eyes, his gaze focused somewhere over her shoulder, and there was a faint flush on his cheeks that might have been from the heat of the kitchen, or might have been something else entirely. "Preston," she began, not knowing what she wanted to say, but needing to say something. He finally looked at her, and the expression in his eyes made her heart skip. "I know this is not the right time, or the right circumstances. You have been through something terrible, and you are still recovering, and the last thing you need is me complicating things. But I want you to know that I care about you, more than I probably should, and when you leave here, I am going to miss you something fierce." Fiona felt like all the air had been sucked from the room. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, and Preston took her silence for discomfort because he stepped back and held up his hands. "I am sorry. I should not have said anything. Please forget I mentioned it. I do not want to make things awkward between us." "No," Fiona finally managed to say. "No, do not apologize. I am glad you said something because I have been feeling the same way and driving myself half mad trying to hide it." Preston went very still. "You have?" "Yes," Fiona said, gaining confidence now that the words were finally out in the open. "I think about you constantly. I look forward to seeing you every morning, and I dread the day when I have to leave here. You make me feel safe and cared for, and I have not felt that way since my mother died. And it is more than that, too. I admire you, and I respect you, and I think you are one of the finest men I have ever known." A slow smile spread across Preston's face, and Fiona thought it was possibly the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He reached out and took her wet, soapy hand in his, seemingly unconcerned about the water dripping onto the floor between them. "I have been wanting to tell you how I feel for weeks now," he admitted, "but I did not want to take advantage of the situation or make you think you owed me anything because I helped you." "You did not take advantage," Fiona said firmly, "and I do not feel obligated. What I feel is genuine and real, and has nothing to do with gratitude or debt." Preston raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "May I court you properly, then? With your father's permission and all the appropriate formalities?" "Yes," Fiona breathed. "Yes, I would like that very much." They stood there in the kitchen with the dishes half done and the fire crackling in the other room, just looking at each other and smiling like fools. Finally, Preston released her hand and picked up his dish towel again. "We should probably finish these dishes before your father comes back in and wonders what we have been doing." Fiona laughed, a sound of pure happiness that bubbled up from deep inside her. "You are probably right." They finished the washing up in companionable silence, but everything felt different now, charged with possibility and promise. When Preston's hand brushed against hers as he took a wet plate, the touch sent sparks up her arm. When their eyes met across the basin, she felt heat that had nothing to do with the kitchen fire. After the dishes were done and put away, Preston cleared his throat nervously. "I suppose I should speak to your father sooner rather than later. I do not want there to be any misunderstanding about my intentions." "He likes you," Fiona assured him. "He has told me several times what a good man you are and how lucky we are that you found me when you did." "That is not quite the same as being happy about his daughter courting me," Preston pointed out, "but I suppose there is only one way to find out." He went out to the barn, and Fiona waited in the house, too nervous to sit still. She paced the small main room, wringing her hands and imagining all the ways the conversation could go wrong. What if her father said no? What if he thought Preston was taking advantage? What if he wanted Fiona to wait until they were settled in their new cabin before entertaining thoughts of courtship? But when Preston and Samuel returned to the house 20 minutes later, both men were smiling, and Fiona felt relief wash over her like a wave. "Preston has asked for permission to court you," Samuel said without preamble, "and I have given my blessing. He is a good man, and I can see that he cares for you deeply. I could not ask for better for my daughter." Fiona hugged her father tightly, blinking back happy tears. "Thank you, Father." "Thank you for choosing well," Samuel replied, kissing the top of her head. "Your mother would have liked him, I think." That night, Fiona lay awake in Preston's bed, which she still occupied while he slept on his pallet by the fire, and thought about everything that had changed. 2 months ago, she had been going about her quiet life, helping her father with the ranch, and not thinking much about romance or marriage or any of the things that most young women her age dreamed about. Then the fire had come and destroyed everything, but from those ashes something new and unexpected had grown. She thought about Preston's smile and the way he had kissed her hand, about the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, and the gentleness in his touch. She thought about spending the rest of her life with him, building a future together in this hard country. The idea filled her with a joy so intense it was almost painful. Sleep came eventually, and with it dreams of spring and weddings, and a love that would last all the days of her life. The courtship progressed with all the appropriate propriety over the following weeks. Preston called on Fiona formally, even though they lived under the same roof, asking permission to sit with her in the evening, and engaging in conversation while Samuel sat nearby, doing busy work and pretending not to listen. They went for supervised walks when the weather permitted, bundled against the cold and talking about everything and nothing. Preston brought her small gifts, wildflowers he had pressed between the pages of a book and a ribbon for her hair that he had purchased from Mrs. Chen. The new cabin was completed in early March, and Fiona felt a bittersweet pang as she and Samuel moved their few belongings into it. The structure was smaller than the original cabin, but sturdily built, with a good fireplace and windows that let in plenty of light. Neighbors had donated furniture and supplies to help them get started, and while it would take time to make it truly feel like home, it was a roof over their heads, and that was what mattered. Preston helped them move, and Fiona could see that he was as reluctant to have her leave as she was to go. They had grown so accustomed to each other's presence that the separation felt wrong somehow, even though they lived less than a mile apart. "I will call on you tomorrow evening, if that is acceptable," Preston said as he prepared to leave that first night. "Very acceptable," Fiona assured him. "I will look forward to it." He tipped his hat to her, and then to Samuel, and rode off into the dusk. Fiona watched him go until he was out of sight, then turned to find her father watching her with an amused expression. "You have got it bad, daughter." "I know," Fiona admitted, not even trying to deny it. "Is that foolish of me? We have only really known each other for 2 months." "Sometimes you just know," Samuel said. "I knew I wanted to marry your mother the first day I met her. Took me 3 months to work up the courage to ask her, but I knew from the start that she was the one. Some things do not require a lot of time to figure out." Fiona smiled and kissed her father's weathered cheek. "I am glad you understand." "I more than understand," Samuel said. "I approve. Preston Hayes is the kind of man who will stand by you through thick and thin, and that is the most important quality a husband can have." Preston came calling the next evening as promised, and the evening after that, and the evening after that. He helped Samuel with heavy work around the new ranch, and gradually his presence became as familiar and expected as the sunrise. Fiona found herself living for those evening visits, for the sound of his horse approaching, and the knock on the door that meant he had arrived. They talked about everything during those long spring evenings, as the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared in the meadows. They discussed their childhoods and their dreams, their fears and their hopes. Fiona told him about her mother's illness and death, about the hard years that had followed when it was just her and her father trying to make the ranch work. Preston told her about growing up in Missouri, about losing his parents and the loneliness that had driven him west in search of something he had not been able to name until now. "I was looking for you," he said one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "I did not know it at the time, but that is what I was doing, searching for the person who would make everything make sense." Fiona reached over and took his hand, twining her fingers through his. "I am glad you found me." "So am I," Preston said softly, "even if it took a cabin fire to bring us together." As spring advanced into summer, Preston's visits grew longer and more frequent. He and Fiona went on proper chaperoned outings, riding into town for church on Sundays, and attending social gatherings where the other ranchers and their families came together to share food and news. People accepted them as a couple, and Fiona grew accustomed to being introduced as Preston Hayes' intended, though no formal engagement had been announced yet. She knew it was coming, though. She could see it in the way Preston looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, in the careful way he was building up his ranch and making improvements to his cabin. He was preparing for a future that included her, and the knowledge filled her with contentment. The proposal came on a warm evening in late June, when the wildflowers were in full bloom across the meadows and the air smelled of sage and pine. Preston had asked Fiona to go riding with him, and Samuel had agreed with a knowing smile, not even suggesting that he should come along as chaperone. They rode to a high meadow that overlooked the valley, a place where you could see for miles in every direction. Preston helped Fiona dismount, and they stood together looking out over the vista of mountains and forests and the silver ribbon of the Grand River winding through it all. The evening sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows and bathing everything in warm golden light. "It is beautiful," Fiona said softly. "I never get tired of looking at it." "Neither do I," Preston agreed, though he was looking at her rather than the view. "Fiona, we have known each other for 5 months now. I know that is not very long by most people's standards, but I feel like I have known you my whole life. You are my best friend and my favorite person, and I cannot imagine spending my days without you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, handcrafted and polished to a warm glow. Fiona's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the light and sparkled like captured starfire. "This was my mother's ring," Preston said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is not fancy or expensive, but it is the only thing of value I have from my family. I would be honored if you would wear it and agree to be my wife." Tears were streaming down Fiona's face, but she was smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said through happy sobs. "Yes, of course I will marry you." Preston slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time. A gentle, tender kiss that tasted of salt from her tears and promised a lifetime of love and devotion. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and flushed, Fiona looked down at the ring on her finger and felt a sense of rightness so profound it was almost spiritual. This was what she was meant for, this man and this life and this love that had grown from the ashes of tragedy. "When should we marry?" Preston asked. "I do not want a long engagement if you are amenable. I have waited long enough for you already." "As soon as it can be arranged," Fiona agreed readily. "I do not need a big fancy wedding, just you and me and our closest friends and family." They decided on August, giving them 2 months to prepare. It was not much time, but neither of them saw any reason to wait longer. The entire community buzzed with excitement over the upcoming wedding, and Fiona found herself the recipient of advice and gifts and offers of help from women she barely knew. Mrs. Chen gave her a length of beautiful cream-colored silk that had been taking up space in the store for years, saying it was meant to be a wedding dress, and Fiona might as well have it. Martha Anderson, the blacksmith's wife, was an accomplished seamstress, and she volunteered to make the dress. The Johnson sisters taught Fiona their mother's recipe for wedding cake. Even grumpy Mr. Peterson donated a yearling bull to the couple as a wedding present, telling Preston he had better take good care of the Reynolds girl, or he would answer to the entire community. Samuel watched the preparations with quiet satisfaction, clearly pleased to see his daughter so happy. He and Preston had become close friends over the months of working together, and Fiona knew her father was glad she would be marrying a man he respected and liked. The wedding took place on a clear August day when the sky was impossibly blue and the air smelled of warm grass and possibility. They held the ceremony outdoors on Preston's land, with Reverend Thompson presiding, and what seemed like the entire town of Palisade in attendance. Fiona wore the dress Mrs. Anderson had made, a simple, elegant creation that flowed like water and made her feel beautiful. She carried wildflowers that Preston had picked for her that morning, a bouquet of purple lupines and yellow columbines and white yarrow. Samuel walked her to where Preston stood waiting, handsome in his best suit, with his hair freshly trimmed and his eyes suspiciously bright. When her father placed her hand in Preston's, Fiona felt the rightness of it all the way to her bones. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices. promising to love and honor and cherish each other for all the days of their lives. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife and told Preston he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was witnessed by an entire community that cheered and clapped and wiped away tears of joy. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. There was food and music and dancing, with folks taking turns playing fiddles and harmonicas while couples spun across the makeshift dance floor. Preston and Fiona danced together, neither of them particularly skilled, but both too happy to care, and Fiona thought she had never been so content in all her life. As the sun set and the stars came out, Preston pulled Fiona away from the party, and they walked hand in hand to his cabin, which was now their cabin. He lifted her over the threshold as tradition dictated, and she laughed with pure joy, her arms wrapped around his neck and her face pressed against his shoulder. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," Preston murmured against her hair. "There is nowhere else I would rather be," Fiona replied truthfully. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, a celebration of the love they had found in each other and the future they would build together. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness with the sounds of celebration still drifting faintly from outside, Fiona thought about everything that had led to this moment. The fire that had destroyed her home and nearly killed her had seemed like the worst thing that could possibly happen. But without that tragedy, she never would have been brought into Preston's life, never would have spent those weeks living under his roof and learning who he truly was. Sometimes, she thought, the worst moments led to the best outcomes in ways you could never predict or plan for. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked sleepily, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "About fate and fire and how strange life can be," Fiona said. "About how grateful I am that you saw the flames that night." Preston pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I will be grateful for that every day for the rest of my life." They fell asleep in each other's arms, husband and wife, beginning the next chapter of their story together. The years that followed were filled with hard work and simple joys. Preston and Fiona worked side by side to build up their ranch, adding cattle and improving the land and slowly creating something they were proud of. Samuel remained on his own property next door, but he was a frequent visitor and a beloved presence in their lives. Their first child arrived in the spring of 1885, a boy they named Paul Samuel Hayes after both grandfathers. He was a healthy, robust baby, with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and both parents were instantly besotted with him. Fiona discovered that she loved being a mother, and Preston proved to be a devoted and hands-on father who was not above changing diapers or walking the floor with a fussy infant. 2 years later came a daughter they named Grace Marie, and then another son, 3 years after that, whom they called Thomas. The cabin rang with the sounds of children's laughter and the patter of small feet, and Fiona thought about how empty the house had been when Preston lived there alone, and marveled at how full it was now. Samuel doted on his grandchildren, spending hours teaching them to ride and fish and identify different plants and animals. He remained healthy and active well into his 60s, though eventually he agreed to sell his property to Preston and move into a small addition they built onto the main cabin. He lived there contentedly for another decade, surrounded by the family he loved, before passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73. His death was hard on all of them, but especially on Fiona, who had relied on her father's steady presence for her entire life. Preston held her through her grief, and their children provided distraction and comfort, and eventually, the sharp pain of loss softened into bittersweet memories of a good man who had lived a good life. The ranch prospered over the years, growing from a modest operation into one of the most successful in the valley. Preston and Fiona earned a reputation for honesty and fair dealing, and they employed several ranch hands who were treated well and paid fairly. They were known throughout Palisade as pillars of the community, always willing to help neighbors in need and quick to contribute to worthy causes. But for all their success and standing in the community, what mattered most to both of them was the life they had built together. The love that had sparked in the aftermath of tragedy had grown deeper and stronger with each passing year, weathering hardships and celebrating triumphs side by side. On cold winter nights, Preston would sometimes tell the story of the fire to their children, and later their grandchildren, describing how he had seen the flames from a distance and ridden as fast as he could to help. He always emphasized how brave their mother had been, trying to save herself even when the situation seemed hopeless. And Fiona would add that their father was the real hero, risking his own life to pull a near stranger from a burning building. The children loved the story, begging to hear it again and again, and as they grew older, they came to understand what a pivotal moment it had been. Without that fire, there would have been no marriage, no children, no family as they knew it. It was a sobering thought, but also a reminder that even the darkest moments could lead to light if you were open to the possibilities. As Preston and Fiona aged together, their hair turning silver and their faces gaining the lines that came from decades of laughter and hard work, they never lost the deep affection and respect they had for each other. They still held hands when they walked, still stole kisses when they thought no one was looking, still found joy in the simple pleasure of each other's company. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1923, their children and grandchildren threw them a party that drew people from all over the county. There were speeches and toasts and a cake that was almost too beautiful to cut. When it came time for Preston to say a few words, he stood with his arm around Fiona's waist and looked out at the sea of beloved faces surrounding them. "I am not much for speeches," he began, his voice still strong despite his 70 years. "But I want you all to know how grateful I am for the life I have been given. 40 years ago, I married the woman of my dreams, and every single day since then has been a gift. We have had our share of hardships, as everyone does, but we have faced them together, and that has made all the difference." He turned to Fiona, and the look in his eyes was the same one he had given her on their wedding day all those years ago. "You are still the first person I want to see in the morning, and the last person I want to talk to at night. You are my partner and my best friend and the love of my life. Here is to 40 more years, my darling." Fiona was crying openly, tears of happiness streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I love you," she said simply, "today and always." They kissed to thunderous applause, and their oldest grandson played a waltz on his fiddle so they could have the first dance. As Preston spun Fiona slowly around the floor, both of them moving more carefully than they had in their youth, but with no less joy, Fiona thought about the young woman she had been on that terrible night when fire had consumed her home. That frightened girl could never have imagined the life that awaited her, the love and family and happiness that would grow from those ashes. She had thought she was losing everything when the flames took her cabin, but in reality she had been standing on the threshold of everything she had ever wanted. She just had not known it yet. Sometimes, Fiona thought, as Preston pulled her close and whispered something silly in her ear that made her laugh, the best stories began with an ending. Her old life had burned away that cold January night, but from those ashes had risen something far more beautiful and lasting than anything she could have built on her own. Preston Hayes had broken through the flames and carried her to safety, but the real rescue had come later, in the quiet moments and shared conversations, and the gradual realization that she had found someone worth building a life with. He had saved her body that night, but over the years that followed, they had saved each other's hearts, creating a love story that would endure long after they were both gone. As the party continued around them and the summer stars came out overhead, Preston and Fiona held each other close and swayed to the music, surrounded by the family and community they had helped build. It was a perfect moment, one they would both remember in the years to come, when age and infirmity made dancing impossible, and memories became more precious than gold. They lived well into their 80s, Preston passing first in the winter of 1936, after a brief illness. He died peacefully in the bed he had shared with Fiona for over 50 years, holding her hand and telling her one last time how much he loved her. Fiona mourned him deeply, but took comfort in the knowledge that they had made the most of every single day they had been given together. She lived for another 3 years, spending her time with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing down the stories and wisdom accumulated over a long, well-lived life. When she finally followed Preston in the spring of 1939, slipping away in her sleep with a smile on her face, those who loved her knew she was going to join the man who had been the center of her world for more than half a century. They were buried side by side in the Palisades Cemetery under a shared headstone that bore their names and dates and a simple inscription that Fiona had requested before she died. It read, "From fire came love, and from love came everything." The ranch passed down through the generations, remaining in the Hayes family for decades to come. And on cold winter nights when the wind howled down from the mountains and the stars shone bright and clear overhead, The descendants of Preston and Fiona would sometimes tell the story of how it all began, with a cabin fire and a cowboy brave enough to ride through the flames for love. It was a story worth telling, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives contain the seeds of our greatest blessings. That courage and compassion can change the course of destiny. That love found in the most unlikely circumstances can last a lifetime and beyond. And it was a story that would never be forgotten, passed down through the generations like a precious heirloom, a testament to the power of two hearts that found each other in the midst of chaos and built something beautiful that would endure long after the flames had faded to ash.